Guys, last night I awoke from a fever dream and realized that half of Cormac McCarthy's novels are driven by some Captain Save-A-Ho crap. And it must have been my Kekule unconscious working because I had just finished Cities of the Plain last night and was surprised how the Save-A-Ho trope was not just used in the first two books, but also in the last book. And not to go armchair psychologist here, but Cormac left three of his wives so that he could focus deeper on his writing, on the lifestyle that he wanted to live. So seemingly he is warning us and views one of the greatest tragedies of men in society. If you guys want unique literature content that I don't post on YouTube, go follow my social medias down below. And if you guys obviously want a Blood Meridian or Cormac McCarthy t-shirt or to join my weekly free newsletter on McCarthy, the links are also down below. Let's get back to the video. As saving people who are energy vampires. And obviously we are talking about men saving women today, but this happens all the time with women who view the bad boys as some DIY project and then 3 years later then wonder why their whole life is ruined. That's like going to a meth house and trying to turn it into a yoga studio. Anyway, so 6 of McCarthy's novels feature this, and we're going to talk about all of them. First of all, let's just start with the Border Trilogy because that's where this is obviously most apparent. In All the Pretty Horses, we have John Grady Cole, who finds refuge from crimes, or supposed crimes, that Rollins and Blevins commit by being a horsebreaker. He's brought in by this family, but the grandma tells him one thing: don't have sex with Alejandra. And what does he do? He goes and does it because he feels that she is being manipulated by her family, that she doesn't have the choice to choose her own love like some Disney movie. But she does, and her grandma says as much. But her family wants her to get married to someone involved in Mexico, someone from Mexico and who involved in the power hierarchies in Mexico, not some orphan from Texas. And honestly, that's pretty reasonable. Some random dude showing up out of nowhere doesn't seem like the best candidate for your granddaughter. But John doesn't listen to the advice, and what happens next? Well, it kicks off the whole chain of events where Rollins probably gets raped, John Grady Cole has to kill a man in prison, and Blevins gets killed. Blevins was probably already going to get killed, but who knows what was going to happen. As we know because of later books, John Grady Cole doesn't have a problem being with prostitutes and being a grimy guy. He could have figured out a way to have sexual intercourse that wasn't Alejandra. He was making decent money and would have moved up the ranks eventually on the ranch. And instead, his one action drives the plot of over half of the novel. Next, we have The Crossing, and this is a little bit lesser, but Boyd's death in The Crossing is because they pick up that girl and Boyd's trying to save her. I mean, if there is a rule when you go down to Mexico or you go into some foreign land and you are alone, is that you don't stop for any stragglers. That's like a rule about the apocalypse too. It's just like you and your people, and like you try and keep it together. And this ultimately leads to Billy's downfall because he was already down because of his parents' death and like things weren't going great. But the loss of his horses and his parents is nothing compared to what he's going to have to do. First of all, to recover Boyd's bones, the trauma of Boyd's death, and all of that. You could say those sequences are what leads him to such a hard life in Cities of the Plains. He's homeless and like experiencing like this terrible reality. I don't feel like the events with John Gray Cole in Cities of the Plain are what drive him toward that. I think it all goes back to, especially the wolf, but also what happens with. And so in Cities of the Plain, once again, the whole novel of the plot is that John Grady Cole falls in love with an underage prostitute and he's trying to save her. He literally builds a cabin and tries to break her out, even though that she has a possessive brother. And I should have mentioned this, like, oh my God, in my other video, that's another example of incest in the Cormac McCarthy novel. That one slipped my mind until I read it again last night. I was like, oh wait, the brother's in love with the sister. And John Grady Cole doesn't go, I mean, the girl gets killed, Magdalena or whatever her name is killed, and John Grady Cole finds her body. And he could leave at this point, right? He could say, you know what? This is a bad situation, but she was a prostitute in a really bad situation, and I got a little bit in it over my head. No, he goes for a retribution killing against Eduardo. And this just really shows you the amount of romantic problems that John Grady Cole has in his brain, and he's trying to find that figure that he never got because his mother was so cold and kind of drove him off of his own ranch, didn't let him do it, and how his father and his heritage. And so the next novel we'll be talking about will be very brief, but in Outer Dark, I really feel like Cola, even though it's thought that he just sets out for work, I think that he's also on a journey to find Rinthi. And by the end of the novel, they seemingly come together, but there's that anticipation that he might run into her at some point. And that all the paths are going to cross, and he's trying to save her. And we don't know the gender of the child, but if it's a girl, Rinty could be out trying to save the child, and the child's obviously not a woman in distress, but I guess she is a woman in distress at some level. Anyway, that one's not as strong. But now let's move on to Suttree, where Cornelius Suttree literally tries to save a hoe. And he gets in this relationship with the prostitute. It's going good for a while, and they're living well. And it seems like Suttree is even imagining a life with they are living well, and he gets a car and whatnot. And eventually she starts to get fat and angry and like all these other things. Like, wow, McCarthy. And what does Suttree do? Eventually he just leaves when things get hard, and he's basically saying, maybe into work, I don't want to do this anymore. He's out of there. He's done saving for the time being. And that's what's so funny about Suttree. He's so lazy that he never really tried to actually save her. And the final novel on our list is The Passenger, because Bobby is fixated a lot of the novel at looking at the past and figuring out what he could have done better to save Alicia, what went wrong during their relationship. And he was trying to save her. And you could say that he didn't go all the way, probably for everyone's best interest. But, when I look at that story, I think that those two, if they would have gone together, things would have probably worked out just fine because they're so weird. Alicia literally has no job, no money. She has a mental illness. He fixates over Bobby, father issues, like all the traits. And Bobby is so conflicted about what he should do that the trauma drives him to, be a race car driver with the death wish. So I just find it interesting that McCarthy, plays with the idea that women lead to the downfall of man, because that's one of the archetypal biblical story. And the more I read McCarthy, the more I see that he values storytelling and crafting it, that these ideas come from like inspired places, especially in the second draft, like at them. But then as he starts to revise, he is just a hawk for revising. That's what like people have said who have taught to him about novel writing and whatnot, our friends and can have that kind of access. His advice is always, it's just all in the rewriting. You find an inspired idea, get it down, and just spend years rewriting it and focusing on sentence structure, these elements, and adding theological elements in the classic way. And that's the lineage he's coming from. He is the King James Bible lineage holder, the Melvillian writer was. And we may never get that again, because most of us were not raised on the Bible, and not everyone around us was raised on it. And we're not living in a society that supports that. And because of technology, we don't have really time to sit with it and like contemplate like Cormac did. And so he could really bring that up. And Cormac really wasn't religious. That's the other thing. Anyone that in 2023 that's going to sit down and read the Bible like that from a very early age, most of the time is to be some religious fanatic, and they are not going to write something like Cormac McCarthy has written, because he has broken through so many barriers in his brain, personally and artistically, and that's why he became great. From what I can tell, he never believed in God in the start, that it was all hogwash. So what are your guys' thoughts on McCarthy using the Captain Save-A-Ho trope? I think it's really funny and amused that McCarthy is one of the OG red pill